What will be necessary to make an impeachment a bipartisan process would have to be extraordinarily clear and compelling. The only thing worse than putting the country through the trauma of an impeachment is putting the country through the trauma of a failed impeachment.
Democrats, including Donnie, in agreement today that to impeach President Trump, the evidence that he committed a crime would have to be so clear-cut and compelling that even Republicans wouldn't be comfortable letting him get away with it. That as we get closer to the end of Robert Mueller's investigations, the questions around what evidence he'll reveal and how he'll reveal it remain wide open. But we have with us the one person who can explain it all. Former acting U.S. Solicitor General and the man who helped craft the special counsel regulations, which gave us Robert Mueller, Neil Katyal, a national treasure himself. It's such a pleasure to have you. I want to ask you to get at something that you've talked about in interviews on other networks and on the daily podcast in the New York Times that you wrote about. What is the danger for Donald Trump if the Mueller report is some concise report, findings of his conduct that leaves us with more questions?
Yeah, so if the Mueller report happened last year, which would be impossible just because these investigations take a long time, but just let's pretend, I think it would have really helped Trump because at that point, Congress was basically his lapdog, not exercising any oversight responsibilities whatsoever, except on, his political enemies or things like that. But now we face a really different situation. There are multiple different investigators, and Mueller has to know that. So even if he writes a short report, as long as the facts come out in that report and leads are able to be pursued, you'll have multiple congressional committees investigating. You will have state attorneys general investigating, perhaps even local district attorneys like Manhattan. And as well, you have two different federal prosecutors' offices, both in the Southern District of New York and in D.C. So, the odd thing is Trump always says this is a witch hunt, but it's his own witch hunt. It's his own prosecutors, federal prosecutors whom he supervises, who are themselves pointing the finger and saying maybe this president is engaged in wrongdoing.
Neil, you wrote two things in your op-ed that I hear when I hear Adam Schiff, when I hear Nancy Pelosi. You yourself have set the bar at criminality. And I want to read two lines from this op-ed because I feel like they're playing back to me in the comments coming out of Democratic leaders. You wrote, Mr. Trump's behavior, including his dangling of pardons to witnesses in the investigation, makes total exoneration unlikely, even though it is enormously difficult to prosecute crimes with international dimensions and assertions of privilege. You also write, there is no impeachment inquiry now, but that could quickly change if Mr. Mueller writes a report that is anything less than a full clearing of the president. Congress would be under a constitutional obligation to investigate the facts for itself. It does not feel like a coincidence that you are setting the bar at clear indication of criminality. Nancy Pelosi setting the bar yesterday at clear, compelling evidence of crimes that would be so disturbing even Republicans would feel like they had to act. And Adam Schiff there saying we would only move to impeach if we were sure to have bipartisan support. Do I have that right?
Well, I don't think you have it precisely right. So I agree the threshold is really high for impeachment, as it should be, because you're, undoing an election and saying someone is unfit. But, Nicole, I don't think that the standard is criminality. I think the standard in our Constitution is something different. It's about fitness for office. So, for example, the story last week about how the president ordered the destruction of the Time Warner merger with AT&T because he was upset with CNN. That may not be a criminal act, but it is a quintessential abuse of the public trust. It is exactly what the founders had in mind when they wrote the impeachment clause. So the standard is really high. That's what what Speaker Pelosi said yesterday and Congressman Schiff. But it's not quite criminality, as it's something different than that.
Do you disagree that criminality is the political bar that Schiff and Pelosi have set?
Well, I don't think it's just criminality that they've said. So, for example, there's this whole question about, is the president obstructing justice when he fired Jim Comey? And, Barr, the attorney general, wrote this 19-page memo which floats the idea, well, no, not necessarily. It's not a crime because the criminal law doesn't actually say the president is included within it. It's a technical legal defense. But I think if he obstructed justice by firing Comey, Comey, whether or not you call it a crime or not, firing those who investigate you just because you're trying to protect your own hide, that is something that is, again, a classic impeachable offense, even if it is not a criminal act. And I don't take it that anything that was said yesterday takes back that just basic common sense idea.
We've never heard anyone suggest that Robert Mueller is not still aggressively pursuing both tracks of this investigation, whether or not there was a conspiracy with Russians and the president's now obvious efforts to obstruct the investigation into him. Can you take us through what that obstruction piece looks like, with the added wrinkle that while Barr wrote that 17-page memo, he also testified in his confirmation hearings that if someone tries to obstruct an investigation into them, he would see that as obstruction.
Yeah, I mean, Barr definitely tried to walk back some of the statements. So it's a classic, crime to obstruct justice. So if you are a prosecutor and you are, destroying evidence or something like that, or even if you're an ordinary citizen, you can't do that. Now, what the president has said is, okay, I fired Comey, who was investigating me, and he even admitted on your network to Lester Holt that I did it because of the, quote, Russia thing. So it looks bad. But the Barr argument is, well, the president has the right to fire anyone for any reason. That argument just doesn't actually fly. It's a bad argument because it's like you have a right to destroy your laptop, Nicole. It's your laptop, and you can throw it in a river, set it on fire, or whatever. It's your absolute right. It's your property. But if you know the feds have a warrant to come seize it, and you go and burn it right before they, knock on the door, that's obviously obstruction of justice. And similarly here, even if the president has a right to generally fire people, he can't do it for a corrupt motive. So I suspect that's what Mueller is really looking at on the obstruction piece. And then, as you're right to say there's this whole other kind of counterintelligence, and sometimes President Trump calls it collusion, but this whole idea where people in the Trump campaign conspiring with the Russians. And there, the investigation's already borne a lot of fruit. I mean, the Manafort, the president's numero uno campaign official, Michael Flynn, the president's national security advisor, his top person, and many others. So, 37 different indictments with 199 counts. It's not looking like, if it's a witch hunt, it's the most successful witch hunt in history.
Neil, can you TikTok me through what would happen, say, if Robert Mueller, I understand from the regulation you wrote, if he's done, the first thing he has to do is pick up the phone or walk over to Attorney General Barr's office and say, I'm done. If that were to happen next Monday, what would happen next?
Yeah, so the special counsel regulations say that when the special counsel is done, at the conclusion of his investigation, he's to provide the Attorney General with a report. They don't have to happen exactly at the same time. You could imagine he can call the Attorney General, say, I'm done, and then say, now I'm moving to the writing of the report phase. So it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily simultaneous. But at that point, then at some point, the Attorney General is going to get that report, read it, and then I think our regulations really contemplated, when you're dealing with high-level wrongdoing, like presidential level, that report gets turned over to the Congress, and really turned over largely in full. Sure, there could be redactions if there's some privacy interest, some sort of, intimate behavior akin to what happened in the Whitewater Report in 1999. But in the absence of that, I think the basic idea is Congress gets to see that report, because the public administration of justice requires a fulsome report to our nation's elected officials.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.